would be unfathomable that truly free people would suffer it without question. So the costs of failing to do this now are that we suffer uh, an artificial sustention of the lifespan at the brink of terminal failure, which means that we're suspended in this state of practically falling off a cliff, artificially kept from doing so only by the fact that they're pouring money into circulation as fast as we're pouring it out, and we're not servicing the new debt that's accumulated by this pouring of money into circulation, which is necessary under this obfuscation of the currency. That the deflationary aspect of this currency, that is the obligation to pay interest and principal out of circulation, is what causes us to need to reborrow that back into circulation to maintain a vital circulation so that we can continue to service even an initial sum of debt. But of course, as we borrow principal and interest back into circulation, this makes it mathematically impossible to pay down the sum of debt. And of course, that is that we pay against principal and we borrow principal back as new debt equal to the old. And of course, then what interest we reborrow back into circulation increases the sum of indebtedness, as we see everywhere around us, until we suffer terminal failure. Of course, as we've gone over in these programs, the computer models that I provided the Reagan administration and which have been available online with complete documentation of this thesis of inevitable failure and singular solution, that is of with the second equating to mathematically perfected economy. These have been online since 1983 and 4, and these models from the later stages of the first term of the Reagan administration of course, projected that the present failure would transpire at approximately 2010 AD. As we have shown, although some people presume that it's practically would be a practically impossible challenge to produce such models and to project failure with such accuracy. Nonetheless, as we can see by evaluating the models, which have been online, not only in binary executable form, but in their source code as well, we can see readily how by no more intangible a process than calculating next month's interest as any bank does with absolute certainty. We accumulate the further debt until it's impossible to any longer to service it, because the accumulation of debt consumes the entire circulation to servicing debt, leaving nothing left to sustain the industry, which is obligated to do so. Of course, this is what we've called the maximum possible lifespan of any purported economy subject to interest, whereas the maximum practical lifespan falls somewhere before this, because of course some of the circulation is vital to dedicate to sustaining the industry, which is obligated to do this. In other words, once more the circulation is dedicated to servicing debt, then it allows us to sustain our industry. Our industry begins to fail, as we're seeing everywhere around us now, and the failure can precipitate like the falling down of the proverbial house of cards. So we're in this suspended state today, where if it weren't for further breach of power or an authority that particularly federal governments across the world are borrowing on our behalf, merely as much as is needed to sustain a vital circulation, we would already be in a far worse failure than we are now. How do we behold the probable and in fact inescapable circumstances of the failure that we're only artificially forestalling for a while here? Well, imagine if we examine each of our possessions at this time, how much money we have on hand, and how long it would take us to pay that money out of circulation in servicing our debts. And we realize that if we weren't sustaining vital circulation by this artificial further borrowing, which we're not even servicing. So, of course, this federal overspending concept, of course, is a breach of the principles even of the obfuscation of the currency. In other words, there's no way that the subject society can ever pay this debt back. In fact, all it can do is accumulate further debt above a terminal sum of debt. So the system is already broken. And so the fact is that if we weren't borrowing this further money into circulation, what would happen is that whatever each and every one of us has on hand, however long it takes to spend that out of circulation, there's no way for it to come back into circulation other than this artificial sustention. So that's how long it would take us to reach rock bottom. In other words, how long it would take us to pay what cash we have on hand out of circulation in the way of servicing existing debts to the purported banking system. So that's how near we are, in effect, to total failure. And this is something that is terribly unflattering. That a society should sit on its hands, for example, and think, oh, well, what should we do? Mathematically perfected economy sounds too difficult, or maybe a person thinks that it's impossible to solve economy still, even though that we've proven that there are actually a simple handful of elementary issues to resolve. The mathematics is second grade math. We can all understand this. People haven't listened carefully. They haven't even taken an interest, many of us, in this critical, mortal problem at the very brink of failure, no less. So it's our own fault if we suffer this further, and the consequences of that, at best, are only to be suspended in this perpetual state of the brink of failure. And of course that has many, many negative consequences, not to mention that no one can realize but a tiny fraction of the prosperity that we are all capable of. Now, why would any intelligent society just haplessly submit to that? That is the question. Can you be harmed by mathematically perfected economy? In 40 years, no one has demonstrated how. I mean, the most, prominent arguments against mathematically perfected economy are offered by exploiters, that no one would rent if we all could own our houses for no more than equal measures of our own production. In other words, they're advocating a crime against us, which is in fact even terminal. And the whole reason for it is, of course, is that this person wants to exploit us themselves. They're a landlord. So we have to adopt mathematically perfected economy. And mark my words, mathematically perfected economy is inevitable. It's preposterous to think that in all the rest of human history, we'll never realize that indeed a 16-year-old high school student delivered the only solution to inflation, deflation, and maladisposition. The only solution to inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of artificial indebtedness, and the only solution, therefore, to systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property. That humanity altogether never realizes is a preposterous thing, because it is just so obvious that if inflation and deflation, for instance, are defined respectively as increases or decreases in circulation per represented property, then obviously the only thing which is neither deflation or inflation is to maintain a circulation which at all times is equal to the remaining value of represented property. And of course then, an eradication of interest and the obligatory schedule of payment of mathematically perfected economy are the only things which accomplish that. So then, it's not a preposterous idea that we resolve the purported debts to banks by issuing, likewise, our own irredeemable promises to pay that they challenge us in court if they want to, which of course is the last thing that they want to do, because if this issue reached the highest courts of every land, which are the only courts where the matter is rightly heard, this would expose this obfuscation, as I've argued it for over 40 years, which is an absolute and blatantly obvious fact. The banks never give up lawful consideration in accord with this claim that a debt exists to the banks. It's a falsified debt. You don't owe the banks. You have an obligation to pay the principal, indeed, out of circulation, because the creditor, the real creditor, the person who gives up the $100,000 house in exchange for your $100,000 promissory obligation, they're paid in full. So the only rightful resolution of our promissory obligations is that principal is indeed an obligation to pay and retire principal out of circulation. Being given that this obligatory schedule of payment of mathematically perfected economy in turn maintains a circulation which is always equivalent to the remaining value of the represented property, then we have a solution of all these issues, even without regulation, because the obligatory schedule of payment automatically maintains the only circulation which is immutable in value, which preserves the original objects of each and every promissory obligation in whole. So it's very accomplishable for us to do this. It requires no more than an accounting system, software, and data which certify the creditworthiness of an individual or individuals, enforce payment, execute payment, automate the whole process, and bingo, you have mathematically perfected economy. As far as potential abuse of the system, there's far less cause for it, and there's far more leeway, as we've shown in great detail, to collect from each and every prospective obligor, as I prefer to call them, rather than debtor. A promissory obligation is not a debt. In other words, you promise to pay the $100,000 house off as you consume of it, but you may sell that house or allow someone else to take over its payments at some point in the lifespan. So you're really not assuming that debt unless no one else ever if it would want to take over proprietorship of the house in the case